For 8 years, the billionaire's son lived in silence. Doctors from every corner of the world examined him, scanned him, tested him, all saying the same cold words: "Your boy will never hear." His father spent millions searching for a miracle that never came. But the miracle wasn't in a hospital. It was already inside his mansion, sweeping floors. One day, the maid noticed something everyone else had missed, something deep inside the boy's ear. And when she finally pulled it out, the truth didn't just shock the boy. It changed everyone's life forever. The Hart Mansion stood like a monument at the top of the hill, grand, imposing, and breathtaking from the outside. 40 rooms, marble floors, chandeliers worth more than most houses, and gardens trimmed with military precision. But behind the polished walls and perfect gardens lived a silence, so heavy it felt alive. Not peaceful silence. Not comforting silence. A silence that pressed on your chest and made every breath feel borrowed. Every morning, servants moved through the hallways like ghosts, their footsteps soft, their eyes lowered. No one dared speak louder than a whisper. Even the slightest sound seemed out of place in that enormous house. Because silence wasn't just a rule there. It was the way the mansion had learned to survive. And in the middle of that quiet world lived Ethan Hart, the billionaire's only son. 8 years old. Blonde hair. Pale blue, eyes that seemed older than his age. Eyes that spoke more than his voice ever had. Because Ethan had never heard a single sound since the day he was born. The doctors had told his father, Alexander Hart, that Ethan's deafness was irreversible. Accept it, they said. Love him as he is. But Alexander was a man who built empires with nothing but ambition and money. Accepting defeat was not in his nature. So he flew Ethan across the world, from Switzerland to Dubai, from Japan to the best specialists in New York. Every door closed the same way, with pity and helplessness. Now, Alexander spent most of his time locked in his study, staring at family portraits where his wife still smiled. She had died giving birth to Ethan, leaving him with a son he couldn't fix and a silence he couldn't escape. Inside that mansion, father and son lived together, yet both were unbearably alone. For 8 long years, Ethan Hart lived inside a world no one else could enter. A world without voices, music, laughter, or warning. To him, life was movement without sound, emotion without rhythm. He watched the lips of others move, saw their expressions change, but none of it reached him. Not even his father's voice, deep, powerful, and commanding to everyone else, meant anything to the little boy who only saw vibrations on Alexander's tense jaw. When Ethan was a baby, every specialist had a different opinion. Some blamed genetics. Others blamed complications at birth. But all of them delivered the same final sentence. He will never hear. Alexander refused to accept it. He was a man who believed everything had a solution. You simply needed enough money to find it. So he spent without thinking. Private jets. The finest hospitals. Specialists with fees so high they didn't need to advertise. Sometimes they flew to him. Sometimes he flew to them. It didn't matter. Alexander would have crossed the world barefoot if it meant helping his son hear a single sound. Every exam began with hope. Every exam ended with disappointment. As Ethan grew older, the silence shaped him. He became gentle, observant, almost too quiet. He learned to read people by their eyes, not their words. But the discomfort in his right ear never went away. Sometimes he rubbed it softly, as if something deep inside bothered him. But the doctors always dismissed it. Ear sensitivity, they said. Common in children like him. Alexander trusted them. After all, they were experts, and he paid them like experts. But trust slowly became guilt. Every time he looked at Ethan, he felt like a failure. He couldn't bring back his wife. He couldn't fix his son. And the mansion that once echoed with possibility now felt like a tomb of broken hopes. Still, he kept searching. Still, he kept paying. Still, he kept praying for a miracle. What Alexander never imagined was that the miracle he spent millions chasing would one day be found by someone who earned minimum wage cleaning his floors. Victoria Hale stood at the tall iron gates of the Hart Mansion with her hands trembling around the straps of her worn handbag. The cold October breeze brushed against her cheeks as she stared up at the estate that looked more like a palace than a home. She had worked in many houses before, but nothing as intimidating or as silent as this one. Still, she wasn't here to be impressed. She needed the job, badly. Behind her, the bus she arrived on hissed as it pulled away, leaving her in a world completely different from her own. Bills waited on her kitchen table. Her grandmother's nursing home fees were months overdue. Her life felt like it was collapsing 1 week at a time. This job was supposed to be her lifeline. When the gates finally opened, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, met her with a stern expression and a clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. "You the new maid?" she asked without warmth. "Yes, ma'am," Victoria replied. "Good. Follow me." No smile. No welcome. Inside, everything felt too perfect. Clean lines, shining floors, portraits arranged with military precision. But the silence, thick and unbroken, made Victoria's footsteps echo inside her own head. She noticed immediately that no one spoke. Servants nodded instead of talking, moving like they were afraid to disturb something invisible. Then, as they passed the staircase, Victoria saw him. A small boy sitting halfway up the steps, lining toy cars in a perfect row. Blonde hair, soft features, eyes too sad for a child his age. He didn't look up, didn't turn, didn't react to their presence at all. "That's Ethan," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "Do not bother him. Do not approach him. Do your job and nothing more." Victoria nodded politely, but something in that boy's quiet world tugged at her heart. Victoria tried to keep her distance, just as Mrs. Patterson instructed. She cleaned the hallways, polished the railings, dusted the shelves, always careful not to step too close to the boy who sat by the windows or the staircase with the same quiet stillness every day. Yet despite her efforts, her eyes kept drifting toward him. There was something about Ethan Hart that pulled at her like a whisper inside her chest. One afternoon, while wiping the glass doors to the sunroom, she noticed him out of the corner of her eye. Ethan sat alone on the floor, a model airplane in his hands. The sunlight formed a warm halo around him, but his little shoulders were tense. He turned the wing piece over and over, trying to fit it in place, growing increasingly frustrated. His brows pinched. His breaths grew unsteady. His small fingers trembled with the effort. He still didn't make a sound. Victoria froze. She knew she shouldn't interfere. Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed loudly in her mind, but watching a child struggle so silently made something ache deep inside her. She had seen kids throw tantrums, cry, scream. But Ethan did none of that. He just sat there, quietly breaking from the inside out. Without thinking, Victoria stepped forward. Slowly, gently, she knelt beside him and extended her hand toward the model airplane. His head lifted. Their eyes met. His blue eyes were wide, guarded, confused, but not afraid. He handed her the wing, almost hesitantly, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to accept help. Victoria took it, examined the piece, and with a soft click, snapped it perfectly into place. Ethan's eyes brightened with surprise. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, the faintest smile appeared on his lips, shy, small, but undeniably real. Victoria felt warmth rush through her chest. She smiled back and gave a gentle wave. To her astonishment, Ethan lifted his hand and waved in return. It was only a few seconds. A tiny exchange. But in a mansion filled with silence, that small moment felt louder than anything Victoria had experienced in years. Days passed, and Victoria continued her chores with quiet discipline, but she found herself watching Ethan more closely, not with curiosity, but with concern. She noticed patterns the others seemed blind to. Every morning, he sat in the sunroom with his toys aligned neatly on the carpet. And every morning, without fail, he touched his right ear. A quick press. A tiny wince. Then he'd lower his hand like nothing happened. The more she observed him, the more she realized it wasn't a casual habit. It was pain, real pain, and no one seemed to notice. One cloudy afternoon, while Victoria was dusting the hallway near the garden doors, she heard a soft thud outside. Her heart stuttered. She pushed open the door and froze. Ethan sat on the stone bench, his body curled tightly, both hands clamped against his right ear. His face, usually calm and distant, was twisted in agony. Tears streamed down his cheeks, falling silently onto his small hands. He wasn't crying loudly, he couldn't, but his entire body shook with the force of his pain. Victoria rushed to him instinctively, kneeling at his side. "Ethan's sweetheart," she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. She touched his arm gently. He flinched at first, startled, but when he recognized her, his trembling eased just a little. His eyes lifted to hers, red, wet, terrified. He signed something with shaky hands, movements quick and broken. She didn't know all his signs, but she recognized fear when she saw it. She gently signed back, "It's okay. I'm here." Slowly, he allowed her to move his hands from his ear. When she did, she saw something she hadn't noticed before, a deeper flinch, a shadow of discomfort that seemed far beyond ordinary sensitivity. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong inside that ear. Very wrong. Ethan leaned into her, silent sobs shaking through his small frame, and Victoria wrapped her arms around him, her heart breaking. No child deserved to suffer in silence, especially not like this. And as she held him, a quiet certainty settled inside her. Whatever was hurting him, she had to find out. After that afternoon in the garden, something subtle and dangerous began to change. Ethan started seeking Victoria with his eyes. Whenever she entered a room, his gaze found her immediately. Whenever she passed him, he straightened a little, watching her footsteps like they were the only movement that mattered. And when she smiled, he softened, as if the heaviness of his silent world lifted for just a moment. Victoria felt it too, a pull she couldn't explain. She knew she wasn't supposed to get close. The rules were clear: clean, stay quiet, and keep her distance. But every time Ethan's small hand reached for hers or left a drawing on a windowsill for her to find, her resolve weakened. There was a loneliness inside him she recognized too well, a loneliness she had lived with her whole childhood. One evening, while polishing the dining table, she sensed a presence behind her. She turned to find Ethan standing there with a folded paper airplane. He held it out shyly, his blue eyes bright with hope. "For me," she mouthed gently. He nodded, tapping his chest twice, a sign she'd learned meant happy. Her heart melted. She whispered, knowing he couldn't hear, "Thank you, sweetheart." Ethan didn't hear the words, but he saw the warmth in her eyes, and that was enough. But not everyone saw their gentle bond the same way. Mrs. Patterson confronted her later that night in the kitchen. "I've seen you interacting with the boy," she said sharply, her expression cold. "That is strictly forbidden." Victoria swallowed. "He's just lonely. I'm not trying to cause trouble." "You're here to work, not to involve yourself in his life," Mrs. Patterson snapped. "If Mr. Hart finds out, you'll be dismissed instantly. Do you understand?" Victoria nodded, but inside her chest, a quiet rebellion sparked. She couldn't ignore Ethan's pain. She couldn't pretend she hadn't seen his silent suffering. Rules or no rules, the boy needed someone. And whether she meant to or not, Victoria had already become that someone. The following week, Victoria worked quietly, trying to obey the rules, but Ethan made that nearly impossible. Wherever she went, he seemed to appear, never too close, never intrusive, but always watching her with those gentle, searching eyes. She tried to keep her interactions brief, professional, distant. Yet the more she noticed him, the less she could pretend nothing was wrong. Because his ear, his right ear, was hurting him more than ever. She saw it every day, the quick wince, the subtle flinch whenever loud movement passed nearby, the way he pressed his small hand against the side of his head as if trying to stop something from growing inside. The pain was becoming constant. And the more she watched, the more she realized this wasn't the typical discomfort the doctors had dismissed. One morning, Victoria found him sitting alone near the sunroom window, unusually still. When she moved closer, she saw the faint traces of dried tears on his cheeks. His hand rested against his ear again. She knelt down and gently signed, "May I look?" Ethan hesitated. Fear flickered across his eyes. But slowly, he tilted his head toward the sunlight. Victoria leaned in, and what she saw made her breath stop. Deep inside his ear, in the narrow shadowed canal, something dark glistened. Something thick. Something that didn't belong. It wasn't just wax. It wasn't just irritation. It looked like a mass, dense, built up, and strangely lodged, as if it had been growing unnoticed for years. How had no one seen this? Her pulse quickened. She leaned back, shaken. Ethan watched her with wide, confused eyes, sensing her change in expression. She forced a soft smile and signed, "It's okay." But inside, she was anything but calm. That night, Victoria replayed the image in her mind 100 times. Doctors had missed this. Specialists had overlooked it. But she, someone with no medical training, had seen it clearly. Something was wrong inside that boy's ear. Terribly wrong. And the longer it stayed hidden, the more danger Ethan might be in. Victoria waited until evening before gathering enough courage to approach Alexander Hart. She found him in his study, surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound books and documents that covered half his desk. A single lamp illuminated the room, casting harsh shadows across his tired face. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in years, because he hadn't. Not since the day Ethan was born. "Mr. Hart," she said softly from the doorway. He didn't look up at first. "Speak," he muttered, his voice tight. Victoria stepped forward. "It's about Ethan. His ear, his right ear, he's in pain. I saw something inside today. Something dark. I really think." Alexander slammed a folder shut. The sound startled her, but Ethan didn't even flinch from across the hall. He couldn't hear it. "Stop right there," Alexander snapped. "You're a maid, Ms. Hale. You are not a doctor. You are not qualified to diagnose anything." "I'm not trying to diagnose him," she said gently. "I'm trying to help. Something is wrong. Something the specialists may have missed." "Impossible." Alexander's voice was ice. "I have paid for the best doctors in the world. They know what they're doing." Victoria felt her chest tighten. "But Ethan is suffering. I saw it with my own eyes." Alexander finally looked at her, really looked. His expression was a mix of exhaustion, fear, and anger. "Do not tell me how to care for my son," he whispered fiercely. "If something was wrong, the doctors would have found it." "They didn't," she said quietly. His jaw clenched. "You're overstepping. Stay away from Ethan unless you are doing your job." Her heart sank. She wanted to scream, to beg him to listen. But she nodded, stepping back. As she left, Alexander leaned against his desk, eyes closing. He wasn't angry at her. He was terrified she might be right. The next 2 days were unusually quiet, even for the Hart mansion. Victoria kept her distance, just as Alexander demanded, but her eyes followed Ethan wherever he went. And every time he touched his ear, every tiny wince cut through her like a blade. Something inside him was getting worse. She could feel it. She could see it. And she feared they were running out of time. On the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the gardens, Victoria was folding linens in the hallway when she heard a faint sound. Not a voice. Not a cry. More like the soft thump of something falling onto the carpet. Her heart stopped. She rushed toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. At the end of the hallway, near the large grandfather clock, Ethan lay curled on the floor, his small body trembling violently. Both hands clutched his right ear, fingers digging into his skin like he was trying to hold the pain inside. "Ethan." Victoria dropped the linens and ran to him, her knees hitting the floor hard. She placed her hand gently on his arm. He didn't look up. His face was twisted, drenched in silent tears. His breathing came in sharp, shaky bursts, too fast, too shallow. He was in agony. Real, unbearable agony. Victoria lifted his chin softly, forcing herself not to panic. "Sweetheart, look at me," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. It didn't matter. Her voice was for comfort, not communication. Slowly, Ethan's glassy eyes rose to meet hers, pleading, desperate, afraid. He signed something with trembling hands, rapid, broken movements she barely recognized, but she understood the emotion behind them. "It hurts. It hurts. Make it stop." Victoria felt tears sting her eyes. She brushed his hair back, scanning his ear. The moment she gently tilted his head toward the hallway lamp, she saw it, clearer than ever. The dark mass had grown. It was swollen now, pressing outward, as if trying to force itself free. His ear canal looked tender and inflamed. No child should suffer this way. And yet the doctors had missed it, dismissed it, ignored it. Victoria gathered him into her arms carefully, letting him lean against her chest. His body trembled with each silent sob, but he clung to her like she was the only safe thing left in his collapsing world. In that moment, all her fear, all her doubts dissolved. Whatever this thing was, whatever it took, she would not let him suffer another night. That night, Victoria couldn't focus on anything. Not the linen she was folding, not the dishes she was drying, not even the ticking of the hallway clock that seemed louder than usual in the quiet mansion. All she could see was Ethan collapsing in her arms, shaking with silent sobs. All she could feel were his small hands trembling against her as he begged her with his eyes to make the pain stop. By the time she reached her small bedroom in the servants' quarters, her hands were still shaking. She closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a breath she had been holding for hours. The dark mass in his ear, it had grown. She had seen it clearly under the lamplight. No specialist had ever mentioned it. No chart had ever shown it. Something had been overlooked, something dangerous. She sank onto her bed and pressed her palms together, her heart pounding. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, warm and steady. God doesn't always send help through the powerful, child. Sometimes he sends it through the willing. Victoria wasn't powerful. She wasn't trained. She wasn't supposed to do anything except clean floors and change sheets. But she had seen suffering before, her younger brother coughing, crying, dying because no one could afford help. She had promised herself she'd never stand by while another child suffered. But this was different. This was the billionaire's son. Acting without permission could cost her everything. Her job, her income, her grandmother's care, even her freedom. If she hurt him, even by accident, the consequences would be devastating. She looked down at her trembling hands. Hands that had fed her brother. Hands that had held her grandmother. Hands that Ethan trusted. Slowly, she opened the small first aid kit she kept in her drawer. Inside, wrapped in sterile paper, was a pair of tweezers she had taken days ago, just in case, she'd told herself. She hadn't known what she would do with them back then. She knew now. A decision settled over her, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and unshakable. Ethan needed help tonight. Not tomorrow. Not after another doctor dismissed his pain. Not after Alexander's anger faded. Tonight. Victoria whispered into the stillness of her room, "Lord, guide my hands." Then she stood, heart pounding, and walked toward the hallway where Ethan was sleeping. Whatever happened next, she would face it. But she would not abandon him. Victoria moved through the silent hallway with her heart pounding, so hard she thought the entire mansion could hear it. The lights were dim, the air cold, and every shadow seemed to whisper a warning. But she kept walking, driven by something stronger than fear. She reached Ethan's room and gently pushed the door open. The little boy lay curled on his side, one hand against his ear, even in sleep. His breaths were shaky, uneven, as if the pain followed him into his dreams. Victoria swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped closer. "Sweetheart," she whispered softly, knowing he couldn't hear her, but hoping he could feel the comfort in her presence. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with exhaustion. When he saw her, he reached out weakly, trusting her without hesitation. That trust pierced straight through her soul. She knelt beside him, smoothing his hair away from his forehead. "I'm here," she mouthed. With trembling hands, she signed slowly, "I need to see." Ethan hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes, then nodded, lifting his chin just enough for the lamplight to touch his ear. Victoria inhaled sharply. The dark mass inside had swollen further, blocking nearly the entire canal. No wonder he had collapsed. He had been living with pain no child should endure. She unwrapped the sterilized tweezers, her fingers trembling not from doubt, but from the weight of responsibility. "Lord, steady me," she whispered under her breath. Gently, she angled Ethan's head and brought the tweezers close. His small body tensed. He clutched her sleeve with one hand, breathing rapidly. She placed her free hand over his, giving a reassuring squeeze. Then she began. Slowly, carefully, she eased the tweezers into his ear, just deep enough to hook the edge of the mass. Ethan's face twisted, tears pooling in his eyes, but he didn't pull away. He trusted her completely. Victoria felt resistance. She pulled gently. Nothing. She tried again, slow, steady, precise. This time, she felt a shift. Her breath caught. With one final, careful tug, something slid free. A thick, dark, hardened mass, years of buildup, trapped deep where no doctor had bothered to look, fell into her palm with a sickening weight. Victoria stared at it, horrified, stunned, shaking. And then, Ethan gasped. Not silently, not mimed. A real audible gasp. His eyes shot wide open as the world around him suddenly erupted with sound for the very first time. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Victoria stared at the dark mass in her trembling hand, hardly believing what she had just pulled from Ethan's ear. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Ethan jerked upright, his eyes wide like he had been struck by lightning. His chest heaved. His fingers flew to his throat as if feeling something new inside himself. A soft, broken breath escaped his lips, audible, real, raw. Then came the sound that shattered the silence of 8 long years. A tiny, shaky gasp. Ethan's own gasp. His mouth opened in shock. He blinked rapidly, looking around the room as if everything had suddenly come alive. And to him, it had. For the very first time, the world wasn't just movement, it was noise. Unfiltered, overwhelming, terrifying, miraculous noise. Victoria covered her mouth, tears welling instantly. Ethan, she whispered. He flinched, not in pain, but in astonishment. He heard something. A sound. Her voice. Soft, trembling, full of emotion. He turned toward her slowly, disbelief etched across his features. He reached out and touched her lips, then touched his ear, trying to connect what he saw with what he just heard. Victoria nodded, tears streaming. She spoke again, barely above a whisper. It's okay. I'm here. Ethan inhaled sharply. His eyes filled, tears spilling down his cheeks, not silent tears this time, but noisy, breathy cries. He pressed his hands against his chest, feeling the vibrations of his own sobs. Every sound startled him. Every breath shook him. But he didn't pull away. He leaned into her, trembling with awe, fear, and relief all at once. Victoria wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as he clung to her like the world had just cracked open beneath his feet. It's the clock, she whispered softly. Ethan turned toward the grandfather clock in the hallway. The steady tick, tick, tick reached his ears, 3 simple sounds that changed his entire existence. His lips parted in wonder. Tick, tick, he whispered. His first word. Victoria broke completely, hugging him tighter as he trembled in her arms. After 8 years of silence, Ethan Hart could finally hear. Victoria was still holding Ethan, her heart beating with overwhelming relief, when footsteps sounded in the hallway. Heavy, fast, urgent. She turned just as Alexander Hart appeared at the door. His face was tight with worry, his eyes scanning the room in confusion. He had heard something, not a crash, not a scream, but something he hadn't heard in 8 years. His son's voice. Ethan. Alexander stepped inside, breath uneven. He froze when he saw Victoria kneeling beside the boy, her hands trembling, her face streaked with tears. He took another step, and then he saw her blood-stained fingertips, the tweezers on the floor, the dark mass in her palm. His entire expression changed. "What have you done?" he thundered, his voice shaking the walls. Ethan flinched at the sudden loudness, startled by the unfamiliar force of sound. He grabbed Victoria's sleeve tightly, pressing himself against her. Alexander's eyes widened. His son had reacted. His son heard him. But the shock was drowned quickly by panic. "Get away from him." Alexander rushed forward, pulling Ethan into his arms. Victoria tried to explain, her voice breaking. "Sir, please, he was in pain, Pain." Alexander barked. "You put your hands on him. You touched him without permission. You could have injured him. Do you understand that?" His voice cracked with fear more than anger, but Victoria couldn't get a word in. Ethan squirmed, shaking his head fiercely, trying to communicate something. He pointed at his ear, pointed at Victoria, tried to form a sound. His breaths grew fast, desperate. Then, "Dad, stop." Barely a whisper. Broken, scratchy, but unmistakably real. Alexander froze. His entire body went still. What did you just?" His voice faltered as he stared at Ethan in disbelief. The boy reached up, touched his father's face with trembling fingers, and whispered again, "Dad." Tears flooded Alexander's eyes, raw, unguarded emotion he had buried for years. His grip on Ethan tightened, but instead of softening, his gaze shot toward Victoria, filled with confusion and terror. "How?" he whispered, voice cracking. "What happened? What did you do to my son?" Victoria opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, the truth marched closer. And the worst misunderstanding of her life was just beginning. Alexander didn't wait for an explanation. Panic had swallowed every other emotion. He lifted Ethan into his arms and rushed toward the front door, shouting for the security team. "Call the doctor, now, and keep her away from my son." His voice cracked with terror more than fury, but Victoria stood frozen, unable to breathe, helpless, as the guard stepped between them. "Mr. Hart, please, just listen," she tried. But he didn't. He couldn't. His world had tilted too fast. Minutes later, they were in the car, speeding toward the hospital. Ethan clung to his father, pointing at his ear, trying to explain with shaky signs. "She helped," he kept trying to say, but Alexander was too consumed by fear to see it clearly. Victoria followed in a separate security vehicle, her wrists trembling, her mind looping one thought. "Please let him be okay." At the hospital, doctors swarmed Ethan immediately, guiding him from one machine to the next, scanning, testing, examining. Alexander paced the hallway like a man trapped between hope and terror. His breaths came sharp and uneven. He couldn't process what he had heard. His son's voice. After 8 years of silence, that single whispered "Dad" had destroyed everything he thought he knew. A doctor finally approached. "Mr. Hart, we found something." Alexander rushed forward. "Is he injured? Is he in danger?" The doctor shook his head slowly. "No, he's recovering. In fact, his hearing response is remarkable." He opened a folder and slid a printed scan across the table. "But this is the part you need to see." Alexander frowned and leaned in. The scan wasn't new. It was from 3 years ago, and circled in red, a dense obstruction inside Ethan's ear canal. "We flagged this abnormality years back," the doctor said carefully. "A removal procedure was recommended. It seems it was never scheduled." Alexander's stomach turned to ice. "What do you mean, never scheduled? My son saw dozens of specialists." The doctor exhaled. "Their notes show ongoing treatment plans, repeated visits, extensive testing, but no intervention, no attempt to remove it." Realization crashed into Alexander like a blow. They knew. They all knew. And they left it there. His millions, his desperation, his endless appointments were profit. The guilt choked him. Every sleepless night, every tear Ethan shed in silence, every moment of pain, all because the experts he trusted had simply ignored the truth. His legs nearly buckled. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable. The only person who had truly looked at his son was the maid he had almost had arrested. Victoria sat alone in the hospital's small security room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't crying anymore. She had run out of tears hours ago. All she could do was pray. Pray that Ethan was safe. Pray that Alexander understood. Pray that she hadn't destroyed the one fragile miracle she'd dared to touch. The door creaked open. She lifted her head. Alexander Hart stepped inside. But he wasn't the furious man who had dragged her away. His shoulders sagged. His eyes were red. And when he looked at her, there was no anger left, only heartbreak. "Victoria," he whispered. She stood slowly. "Mr. Hart, I never meant to overstep." He was in pain. He shook his head hard. "No more apologizing." His voice cracked. "I owe you an apology." Victoria blinked, stunned. Alexander stepped closer, emotion trembling in every word. The doctors, they saw the blockage years ago. They ignored it. They took my money and let my son suffer. His voice broke. And you're the only one who actually cared enough to look. Victoria's breath hitched. You saved him, Alexander whispered. You gave my son something I thought I would never hear again, hope. His eyes filled with tears. And his voice. At that moment, the door behind him burst open. Victoria. Barely a whisper. Small, shaky, but unmistakably his. Ethan darted past his father and ran straight into her arms. He wrapped himself around her waist, burying his face against her stomach. His tiny voice cracked as he said, "Thank you." Victoria dropped to her knees, hugging him tightly as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You're welcome, sweetheart," she whispered into his hair. Alexander watched them, father, son, and the woman who had changed both their lives. For the first time in 8 years, he wasn't drowning. He was breathing. When Ethan pulled back, he touched his chest, then touched hers. A sign she knew well. Safe. Victoria smiled through her tears. And in that quiet hospital hallway, a new chapter began. Not with silence, not with fear, but with the sound of a little boy's heartbeat, and the hope of a family finally being whole.